Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia. Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia. May the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ enlighten the eyes of our hearts, that we may know what is the hope that belongs to our call. Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer greatly from the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. Then Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. God forbid, Lord, no such thing shall ever happen to you. He turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are an obstacle to me. You are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do." Then Jesus says to his disciples, "Whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. What profit would be there for one to gain the whole world and forfeit his life? Or what can one give in exchange for his life? For the Son of Man will come with the angels in his Father's glory, and then he will repay all according to his conduct." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise the Lord Jesus Christ.
The Gospel of our sins. Well, good morning. And it's so wonderful to be surrounded by so many others who couldn't get away for the Labor Day weekend. So thank you for being here. Besides, the weather's not that great, so I think we'll all just be fine staying here. But again, thank you for being with us. You know, as we hear this gospel reading this morning, I think we really need to ask ourselves a very critical question. Am I an obstacle to my own salvation and to the salvation of others? And that's what Jesus accused Peter of being, because of his response when Jesus revealed to him the suffering and death that he was going to endure. Here's Peter, our first pope. He's the same guy who had just received the keys to the kingdom of heaven, the guy he now calls Satan. Or maybe he was talking directly to Satan, who was trying to tempt him through Peter. But regardless, why is he so upset with Peter? Well, I think it's simply because Peter couldn't yet bring himself to an understanding of God's will and his plan for the salvation of mankind. You see, I don't think Jesus was responding to Peter solely out of any anger, but rather it was probably out of frustration. Frustration in Peter continuing to be led by his thinking as a human being, as a person in this world, and not yet as one who could see the big picture of salvation through the suffering and death of Jesus, the Messiah. And particularly, this right after Peter had just come to the realization that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of the living God. But he just couldn't yet come to trust in the will of God. You see, he wanted a different course, because this course totally conflicted with his great love and concern for Jesus that was defined by his human relationship with him. I think his response was apparently quite natural. And wouldn't we all have responded in the same manner out of love and concern for such a great friend? Peter couldn't see how God's will could lead to such a horrifying and terrible thing. And the poor guy just seems to get himself in trouble again every time he opens his mouth and he seems to be too quick to speak. I think Peter should be the patron saint of all of us who so often say the wrong thing at the wrong time. I think we would agree many of us would be praying to him quite a lot. But don't we all live this experience at times when we don't accept or understand God's will in our lives? When we allow our human nature, our human emotions, and even our human weaknesses to dominate our thinking, and we just focus more and more on the here and now of our earthly existence. When we can't see or recognize God's will or God's way of thinking. If we would all agree then, certainly God does offer his will, oftentimes does conflict with our will. And we see that certainly in this case with Peter. In this gospel, Jesus responds to Peter, but I believe he's also speaking to all of us through the ages. We are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do. So you see, here's the great challenge. We are human beings. So how can we not think as human beings? See, as humans, our thinking is typically based on practicality, many times self-interest, certainly survival, and mostly it's present-centered. But at times, we do try to predict things to come. Our thinking is often relational, it's very rational, and it responds only to the physical universe in which we live. But Jesus calls us to a higher level of thinking, in trying to assume the ways of God, not the ways of the world. And that's what St. Paul was telling the early church in Rome. Do not conform yourselves to this age, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that you discern what is the will of God, what is good and pleasing and perfect. So today, let's ask ourselves, how do I think? How do I react and interact with the world around me? What's the basis for my decisions in life? And how do I approach my relationships with my spouse, my kids, my friends, my neighbors, even with strangers that I might meet? And how do I respond to crisis or tragedy in my life or in the lives of others? These are very heavy questions for us to consider as we hear these scriptures today. So how must we try to raise our thinking beyond the human and into that realm of God's Spirit within us? How do we today move beyond only the materialism, the physicality, and the superficiality of our human condition and into that realization or that understanding and that influence of our spirituality, that brings us to recognize God's will in our lives? How do we, as St. Paul asked, renew our minds? Well, it's certainly not easy. It's hard not to conform our lives to this age. It's our greatest challenge, yet it's the greatest joy as Christians. We are so entrenched in our humanity with its constant concerns and its demands, its pleasures and its sorrows, its relationships and its struggles, its rewards and its disappointments. And we know that the culture of the world we live in really tries to impact and influence our thinking. Just look at how TV and the media is so influential in forming the minds, the conscience, and the opinions of so many of us. It can totally affect our way of thinking. And if you watch enough TV and movies, you'll soon see that the world creates its own set of moral values, values that so often run completely counter to Christian values. Storylines often romanticize the weaknesses of human nature. It's okay to lie and cheat as long as the end seems to justify those means. Sexuality is freely expressed and shared casually, most often outside the loving relationship of marriage. In fact, often outside the relationship of any love at all. And certainly violence is endorsed as the way to solve most problems. And we see killing become routine, and it's certainly not shocking in any way or form. Human life often seems to have little or no value. No wonder our minds and our thinking are not conformed to the way of God. And God's will is so often far removed from the formulas of our thinking. So we must work hard at establishing that way of thinking that brings God's plan into our lives. And through devoted times of quiet contemplation, maybe personal prayer, and very deep introspective thought, we can begin to discern the will of God in our lives as we hear Him speaking to our hearts. If we can just filter out the noise and distractions of the world and its influences, We can focus our hearts and minds on the way of God to help us in all our decisions, reactions, and responses that the world brings to us. When we take time to focus our thoughts on God's love and mercy and on His plan for us, we arrive at new ways of seeing the world. When we raise our awareness to God's presence in our lives and just seek to follow His command to simply love one another, we can begin to see the world not as the be-all and end-all of our existence, but rather as the path to our eternal salvation. And especially to you young people here with us this morning, don't ignore this message. Don't put it off. Don't wait until you're old and gray before you begin living your lives in the awareness of God's will for you. As you grow and come to make decisions about your careers, your profession, or your vocation, your relationships, pray that it is God's will for you. Search your heart, and you'll find Him there. He'll let you know your purpose and how best to fulfill it. You'll learn to make all decisions based on love, not on money, good looks, power, or control. And for all of us, always know that if any thought or reaction about anything is of hate, discrimination, or exclusion, it's not of God's thinking. If it's of indifference, intolerance, or prejudice, it's not of God. If it's vindication, anger, or aggression, it's not of God. If it's feeding ego or self-gain at the expense of another, it's surely not of God. But rather, if it's friendship, love, compassion, and mercy, it is of God. If it's of forgiveness, tolerance, welcoming, and acceptance, it is of God. If it's of helping, sharing, and giving, it is certainly of God. And if it fosters hope and brings joy and peace in the world, it's truly God's will. This is our beginning of understanding God's will on earth. And this is how we can begin to conform ourselves to God's way of thinking. This past week in Southeast Texas and Louisiana, we witnessed the work of God through so many people. Neighbor helping neighbor, strangers helping strangers. There were no racial barriers, and immigration status was set aside as good people just helped one another. You know, though many question God's will in human tragedy and natural disaster, the will of God always seems to become so visible when great need and crisis arises, and good people respond in His love. The images seen on TV certainly gave us both heartbreak and sorrow, but I believe they also gave us hope. Hope in humanity to respond to God's will. So let us today pray for the victims and the survivors, that they may find comfort in the love shown by strangers, and they may find strength, resources, and hope to rebuild their lives, and rise up into a new awareness of God's love as shown to them through the actions and generosity of others. And as we prepare to open our hands and our hearts to receive Jesus in the Eucharist, let us pray that we can be transformed by the renewal of our own minds and discern what is the will of God in our lives. And that through our thoughts and actions of love, we can avoid conforming our lives solely to this world so as not to be obstacles to our own salvation or to the salvation of someone else. God bless you.